This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Welcome to Green Pulse, a podcast series by the Straits Times where we analyse the beats of the changing environment, from biodiversity conservation to climate change. I'm your host Audrey Tan, and my co-host is David Fogarty.
Hi, I'm David, and I'm the climate change editor at the Straits Times.
It is the 20th of October. Governments are at the heart of global climate action, setting the policies and direction for business and the public. And your influence will be on full display at the COP27 climate talks in Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt in November. Delegates from nearly 200 nations are tasked with accelerating action on climate change and boosting finance for poorer countries. But many governments have been slow to act, leading to rising greenhouse gas emissions and global temperatures. What can be done to speed things up? Joining us today to discuss the key role of governments is Ms Sharon Seah, Senior Fellow at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute and Coordinator of the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program. Thanks for joining us today, Sharon.
Thanks for having me, Audrey and David.
So today we're going to be discussing the role of governments in pushing for climate action, but maybe you can start by giving us an overview of why governments are so important in this area.
Well, people mandate governments, right, to act on a range of issues or problems facing them, and we give them this mandate typically in an elected government every 4 or 5 years. And they can do a lot of things that corporations and individuals can't. For instance, they can roll out planned reforms, policies, mobilize large-scale resources, manpower, and most importantly, also cooperate with other governments. And all these actions can be at scale, something that individuals, corporations can't do. So if governments refuse to act, or worse, they hinder efforts, as the Trump administration had done, it's as good as just sitting back and watching this grand climate drama unfold. Governments now are expected to respond, and in the face of climate danger, they should not only respond but proactively face it head on. And there's a great deal of appetite for action. For instance, in the UN People's Vote taken last year, over 50 countries and 1.2 million respondents, majority want to see stronger policies from government.
So Sharon, what are some of the key tools that governments can use to speed up emissions cuts and investments in clean energy?
So I think the question we have to ask is, what are governments good at, right? They're good at, as I mentioned, policy. They're good at moving the private sector, good at moving the masses. So the fastest way to reduce emissions is either you cut it at source, or like Greta Thunberg says, grow this technology called the trees to take out the carbon emissions. Or, the more expensive option, deploy carbon capture technologies, which take a really long time and it's not exactly feasible at this moment. So I want to talk about coal. Coal is the lowest hanging fruit. It is the most pollutive and worst of fossil fuels. Coal power plants produce a fifth of global greenhouse gas emissions, more than any single source actually. But there is a stubborn refusal to move away from coal. Why? Because it's portable, it's easy to use, it's easy to mine. However, as we all know, moving away from coal will actually yield benefits from the environment to health benefits. Millions of us live in polluted cities in Asia, and we suffer from poor respiratory health. And here in Southeast Asia, although we've seen a 63% decrease in scale of pipeline of proposed coal power plants since 2015, we still see financing for coal taking place, and new coal power pipelines are still in the works for many countries in Southeast Asia. So this transition away from coal to clean energy actually needs large-scale private and public investments in energy infrastructure, grids, new technology. So governments can pay part of the bill, but clearly no one entity can foot the whole bill. So governments need to now think creatively of ways to involve the private sector, create bankable projects for investors to take part in. And some governments have already started doing that by raising green bonds, providing that base level of assurance for investors. Vietnam, for instance, also rolled out an aggressive in-tariff to encourage adoption of solar energy. So these are just some examples that they've been able to take action. And the last one, which I feel is very underrated, is actually promoting energy efficiency. So as we think of all these very exciting new cutting-edge technologies like deploying green hydrogen, CCUS, and so on, we forget that a very simple tool is available for us, which is encouraging energy efficiency down to the corporates, down to the individual level.
Thanks, Sharon. So you really outlined like a whole slew of measures that governments are able to take when it comes to cutting emissions and averting the harshest impacts of climate change. So the question is, why are they so slow to act? Especially certain countries, we see a lot of inertia. For Singapore, we also see that, the government has said that natural gas and fossil fuel will continue to be our dominant source of fuel in the future. So what do you think accounts for, the inertia?
Governments are made up of elected politicians, mostly. In some regimes, they are not. But we see no politician actually wants to bet their career on climate change. It's risky business. And it's risky why? Because they cannot see change in his or her term or tenure of 4 or 5 years. If you're lucky, you get 8 or 9 years, right? And you can't see that change, then it means that it cannot be credited to you. So no government has come into power on a completely green ticket. In fact, you are a bit of a loser if you just campaign on a green ticket, right, with no promises of economic development or new jobs or welfare. And in the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey that ISEAS does every year, in this year's edition, nearly 50% of our respondents believe that their country's political parties don't prioritize climate change. So in that sense, I think it's really hard, for politicians, for governments to try to act and to try to change. In some green parties across the world, you see that they form a very, very minority in the parliament. They don't actually they're not powerful enough to form the majority coalition. Yeah, and that really hampers some of the action. The will might be there, but the flesh is weak.
Now, some governments are also heavily influenced by powerful business lobbies, such as mining, oil, and gas, and agriculture, of course. So could you explain how they influence governments and the possible ways to counter these powerful forces?
So I think we need to take a bit of a historical perspective on this. Economic development is contingent on extractivism, meaning that the industrial development strategy of many countries in the world actually depended on how much and how fast we can extract natural resources, minerals, and raw materials for either your own use or for export. So we are talking about gold, silver, diamonds, crude oil, gas, iron ore. And this sort of capitalist, extractivist, developmental framework, right, has remained with us and continues to drive industrialization for growth. So you see a lot in terms of the industries, right? Industrial resource extraction, industrial agricultural policies exist today. And in fact, when I talk about historical perspective, colonial regimes were established by extractivist industries, your big oil, mining giants, resource commodities players, and so on. They're part of the industrial extractivist model. So newly decolonized and independent states of Asia, back 50, 60, 70 years ago, then continued with this model by taking over and expanding these industries. And as a result, also in parts of Southeast Asia, you see big businesses are actually intimately associated with the military. So it's in the interest of powerful businesses to ensure that this extractivist developmental model is not dismantled. It's also in the government's interest to ensure that they deliver on public goods, on developmental gains. So you see a symbiotic relationship there. And it's a relationship that is very hard to change, very hard to get away from. So powerful businesses, what do? They lobby, they persuade, cajole, coax change that benefits them ultimately. But there's a silver lining, because powerful businesses that are listed publicly, for instance, are accountable to another set of stakeholders. If their shareholders want to see change, they have to demonstrate change. And increasingly, we see the voices of institutional investors, and even down to the private shareholders and consumers demanding the change, demanding to see transparency, accountability from the companies. So companies cannot ignore them. They have to show change, or at least show a facade of change.
Find us on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or via the Google Voice Assistant and Amazon Alexa-enabled devices. And now back to our podcast episode.
Thanks, Sharon. So you did mention the latest Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey, which your team at ISEAS released last month. So you did mention also that half the respondents feel that their governments are not doing enough to tackle climate change. Did the survey also touch on what kinds of climate leadership people in ASEAN are expecting from their governments?
One of the things that the respondents felt very strongly was that governments should be the lead in taking change, followed by private business and industry. And when we came to the questions on energy, Southeast Asians actually want governments to phase out coal. And over 62% of them want to put a halt to new coal power plants. Another 72% want governments to cut it ASAP. And surprisingly, actually, for those of us who were doing the survey, majority say that it should be phased out immediately or by 2030. At the back of our minds, we thought that reliance might continue for a couple more decades, but 62.4% say no, immediately or by 2030. So, and the other thing that people want to see is, surprisingly, that this idea of a carbon tax. So it shows that Southeast Asians are not close to this idea of a carbon tax for the sake of the environment, for the sake of the climate. And in fact, in the survey, it shows that the higher your educational attainment, the higher your socio-economic status, the higher the acceptance of a carbon tax. So I think governments can take heart in this finding. Across ASEAN, Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand actually expressed moderately strong support of taking on a carbon tax for the sake of the climate. Among other policies, they definitely want to see governments step up a lot more in driving decarbonization. They want to see a move towards cleaner energy. And these are some things, I mean, there's a lot on the plates of the governments now, recovering from the pandemic of the last 2 to 3 years. So these things may not be top of mind for the governments, and also bear in mind that in ASEAN, many governments will be undergoing political change. Our neighbor Malaysia has already called for the GE. Sometime this year or next year, Thailand may call for a GE as well, and Cambodia, and maybe some others, we won't know. But when we see political change, then some of these issues get on the back burner.
So this leads to a very key question, I think, and that is certainly for Southeast Asia, but I guess it applies really globally, the need for better cooperation between governments. I guess two questions here. In what way can governments in this region cooperate better on climate action? And then I guess the second part of that is, what are 3 key policies that governments in the region should focus on to accelerate climate action? So, for example, earlier you mentioned energy efficiency, which I think would be a major example.
I think there's growing recognition that no government can go it alone. And some more enlightened governments have begun to, think very seriously about the way they should cooperate with their immediate neighbors or between regions. The EU, for instance, has rolled out a slew of policies, right? The EU Green Deal, Next Gen, the Global Gateway Initiative, and many of these initiatives target climate change as a way to cooperate. And they not only want to cooperate on their continent, but they want to do it outside of it, because they realize that even if you're top of class, you can't move that needle on your own. In the same way, I think Singapore has that realization too, that, you can do very well on your own, but if you can't move your own neighborhood along with you, all that goes down to nothing. So they have to work together. And one of the most, so I'm not talking about piecemeal cooperation, doing your capacity building, raising your awareness and all that. No, we have to think about a major transformation of your economies, basically turning it all upside down, not thinking about your growth in terms of GDP, thinking about putting that price, and one of the very useful tool is to put a price on carbon. So we are all mistaken in thinking that we don't need to pay a price for emitting GHG. In fact, we do. We are already paying it in the form of super typhoons, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and soon rising sea levels. That is the cost of our actions. And we pay it in adaptation costs, in response and recovery costs, in rebuilding. And all of that is not factored in, right? But once you put a price on carbon, then we actually understand how much it's costing us to save this world that we live in. Companies are starting to understand that, and we see that companies increasingly, they actually adopt an internal carbon price, even if the country or the jurisdiction that they operate in don't put an an external price on them, they use it to measure and quantify the real cost to their own businesses. And so why shouldn't governments? Well, of course, taking on a carbon pricing instrument should be complemented by other policies. As of now, 5 out of 10 ASEAN member states have indicated intentions or are already using a carbon pricing tool. So that's very encouraging. Now, if all 10 can adopt carbon pricing tool, and that means more doors are open. You can then engage truly in a regional carbon trading mechanism. You can then, do a lot more things together, in terms of moving as a whole. I always take a very ASEAN-centric view in the work that I do, and I hope that this is something that can be done. Another one is to tap into some form of regional cross-border electricity trading. So this is big, right? You need not only to build that infrastructure. We have some existing infrastructure. The Lao Thai Malaysia Singapore pipeline, power integration pipeline (PIP) is one way, and they've started a very pilot 2-year trial to import about 100 megawatts of green energy into Singapore. And that actually, in EMA's words, is a pathfinder for greater regional multilateral trading of electricity. And if we can work to expand that and get more countries on board, upgrade the infrastructure, do it in a multi-layered grid manner, find more connectors between countries, it actually can be a way for the region to really transition away from dirty fossil fuels. In fact, the IEA tells us that we have enough renewable energy in this region alone to power ourselves. Problem is equitable distribution and allocation across the region. So countries like Singapore, for instance, will be alternative energy challenged due to very, very real constraints, right? And then others have a lot more to share. And if there's a mechanism for countries to trade and to buy or sell electricity between each other, that would be, fantastic as a way to cut that reliance on dirty fossil fuels. So these are some ways that I can think of for governments to cooperate together in the region to accelerate climate change.
Thanks so much for your time, Sharon. We'll have to wait and see how things pan out later this year, especially after COP27.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Sharon. It was great.
Well, that's a wrap for Green Pulse, and we hope you enjoyed our discussion. For more on climate change and the environment, do check out our stories in the Straits Times. And don't forget to subscribe to our Green Pulse podcast series on your favorite audio apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts.
That was a podcast by the Straits Times. Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or via the Google Voice Assistant and Amazon Alexa-enabled devices. For more podcasts by the Straits Times, the Business Times, and Money FM 89.3, you can also download the Audio by SPH app. That's AWEDIO.